My name is Kyle Gerber, and I'm a first-year doctoral candidate over in the Department of English, and so I feel completely out of sorts on this side of campus. But we look forward to a good afternoon here. The Pascal Lecture Series was mandated in 1978 by the Board of Governors here at the University of Waterloo in an effort to nurture and foster an intersection of conversation between academic and faith lives. And the Pascal Lectures endeavors to bring to the University of Waterloo outstanding individuals who have of international repute, who have distinguished themselves in both an area of scholarly thought and in the area of Christian thought or life. These individuals discourse with the university community on some aspect of its own world, its theories, its research, its leadership role in society, challenging the university to a search for truth through personal faith and intellectual inquiry, which focus on Jesus Christ. And as a part of that conversation today, we want to invite your questions. After Dr. Lennox speaks for a while, you'll have an opportunity to engage, and we're going to mediate that by having you submit questions either via text message, the number to text will be on the screen there, or by passing a piece of paper with a question on it to an attentive usher. And if possible, please keep your questions succinct and to the point. We want to have as much dialogue as we can. Professor John Lennox is an Irish mathematician, philosopher of science, and Christian apologist who is professor of mathematics at the University of Oxford. He holds a PhD from Cambridge, a Doctor of Science from the University of Wales in Cardiff, and a Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford. Dr. Lennox speaks 5 languages and has published extensively in the field of mathematics. He remains interested in the interface between science, philosophy, and theology, and it is our great privilege to have him here today with us. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. John Lennox.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As I said last night, it's an honor to be invited to give these lectures. And our particular topic this afternoon, the quest of miracles, is one of the major areas of very understandable tension between the scientific community and the theological community. And I'm going to try to say some things about it, and then we'll have time for questions. The word miracle itself comes from the Latin miraculum, which means something to be wondered at. And I suppose I could say that it's a miracle after last night that anybody's turned up this afternoon. That kind of miracle is not going to be the subject of what I am thinking about. The Oxford English Dictionary, always more serious, says that a miracle is a marvelous event occurring within human experience which cannot have been brought about by human power or natural agency and must be ascribed to the special intervention of the deity or some supernatural being. And that's where the problem starts. Stephen Hawking, for instance, talking about the laws of nature, says these laws should hold everywhere and at all times, otherwise they wouldn't be laws. There can be no exceptions or miracles. Gods or demons couldn't intervene in the running of the universe. And a lot of this goes back to a very famous statement by the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume, who wrote that a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and as a firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle from the very nature of the fact is as entire as any argument from experience as can be imagined. And you've probably all seen the marvelous cartoon where a mathematician is standing at a whiteboard and he writes a great bunch of mathematics on the left-hand side, and he leaves a space, and then he writes some more on the right-hand side, and in the middle he writes, and then a miracle occurs, in order to get from the left to the right. And I can understand it very well when many of my colleagues think that any invocation of the supernatural is an intellectual cop-out, a kind of God of the gaps explanation. Indeed, it's not an explanation at all. I understand that, and I take it very seriously. I don't think it is, but I think that I have the responsibility of doing a little bit of explaining. I've come across some very strong reactions in my experience when I speak on the topic of miracle. For instance, when I debated Richard Dawkins the second or third time in the Oxford Museum of Natural History, which of course is a place made famous by the Huxley-Wilberforce debate, commemorated by what's called the Darwin plinth, Richard was staggered, really, because he picked up that I believed in the miracles of the New Testament. And this was the way he started the conversation. The irony of it, at the time, during the debate, I thought I recalled that the building in which we were debating was actually built in order to celebrate the Creator's glory. And I wasn't quite sure, so I put it to Richard during the debate that this building was built for the glory of God. And he said, oh no, he'd had a room in it for several years. I discovered afterwards that not only was it built deliberately to celebrate creation, but the finance came from the surplus profits of the sale of Bibles by Oxford University Press. That's irrelevant to what I'm about to say, but it was just a very interesting context. Dawkins was supposed to be presenting the case that science had buried God in a building constructed specifically to show that science showed the glory of God. And he identified me in no uncertain terms as an Oxford mathematician who, believe it or not, held that, for instance, Jesus walked on water and turned water into wine. And of course he was, as he's entitled to do, gently mocking me for my stance. Of course, mockery is not an argument, and it doesn't always do credit to the person that employs it in this kind of connection. Indeed, after all, if Jesus actually is God as he claims to be, he invented water in the first place, so perhaps turning it into wine, walking on it, wasn't such a big deal after all. Now, there are two separate issues in this discussion, and they need to be clearly separated. Because I find, understandably as I say, that many of my colleagues are not prepared even to consider, for instance, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which of course is one of the central pillars of Christianity, and they're not prepared to consider it for the simple reason that they feel there are strong a priori reasons for rejecting the supernatural completely. Now, if you've got strong reasons for saying the supernatural is a non-category, of course you won't be interested in any specific case. And again, Richard Dawkins said to me privately, I just can't imagine why anybody would be interested in the resurrection of Jesus. So there are two separate questions. The first is the in principle case. Is it right, as Hume says, that miracles violating the laws of nature, which we know, that it's impossible for a scientifically educated person to believe in them? Now, if we can settle that in the positive, that is, it is impossible to believe in miracles, then of course Jesus did not rise from the dead, and that's the end of the story. But if we think there's reason enough to believe that miracles are actually possible in light of science, not disregarding it, but taking it into consideration, then the second step is, of course, not automatically to accept every miraculous claim, but to investigate each claim on its own merit. And that's important. Francis Collins, who worked on the genome, and in fact directed the Human Genome Project after Jim Watson, it's interesting, an atheist replaced by a Christian. Francis Collins, who's now the director of the National Institute of Health in the USA, and does believe the miracles of Jesus, including the resurrection, very wisely remarks that it's crucial that a healthy skepticism be applied when interpreting potentially miraculous events, lest the integrity and rationality of the religious perspective be brought into question. The only thing that will kill the possibility of miracles more quickly than a committed materialism is the claiming of miraculous status for everyday events for which natural explanations are readily at hand. I take that warning. We do need to be cautious. And thinking of David Hume, we shall need to have considerable evidence before we commit ourselves to any particular miracle, even if we have cleared the barrier of coming to accept that miracles are possible. Now, the word miracle, as I've said, comes really from the word for wonder. In the New Testament, it tends to reflect the word semeion, which is a sign from which we get semiotics. Jesus did many signs, and the point of them was they were special things that he did which were not arbitrary, like making birds out of clay and so on, but they pointed to deep facts about himself. They were indicators at one level of something at a much deeper level. Now, miracles are, in my understanding, genuine miracles are supernatural events. But not all supernatural events are miracles in the strict sense. For instance, the origin of the universe, I believe to be a supernatural event. The cause was God. But miracles, as we normally understand them, are exceptions to recognized laws. And so the existence of the whole universe doesn't come in that category. So that's why I say miracles are supernatural events, but not all supernatural events are miracles. The existence of the universe is not an exception to any recognized laws. But once you've got the universe with its regularities and laws, then you raise the more strict problem of miracles. So having said that, I simply remind you that central to the Christian faith is the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. C.S. Lewis expresses it very accurately when he said the first fact in the history of Christendom is a number of people who say they've seen the resurrection. If they died without making anyone else believe this gospel, this good news, no gospels, no accounts of the kind we have would ever have been written. According to the early Christians, without the resurrection, there is no Christian message. If Christ has not been raised, wrote Paul, then our preaching is vain and your faith is vain. So let's think a bit about David Hume and miracles. I quoted his statement, a miracle is a violation of laws of nature, and he goes on very interestingly to say, it is no miracle that a man seemingly in good health should die on a sudden, because such a kind of death, though more unusual than any other, has yet been frequently observed to happen. But it is a miracle that a dead man should come to life, because that has never been observed in any age or country. There must therefore be a uniform experience against every miraculous event, otherwise the event would not merit that appellation. 2 points at this stage about that. The first is, it's interesting that he uses the example of human resurrection, and secondly, that he claims that this event has never been observed in any age or country, which of course is a direct contradiction of the early Christian claim is that they believed it precisely because they did observe it. And we can come back to that later. But what Hume is advancing, as I understand it, are two arguments. One comes from the uniformity of nature, miracles are violations of that, and the laws have been established by firm and unalterable experience, and so the argument against miracles is firm. Now, arguments from the uniformity of nature, which is a major presupposition of science, and the idea that if I do an experiment today and repeat it tomorrow, done under the same conditions, we'll get the same results. If that wasn't more or less true, of course, experimental science would collapse. And that's another reason why many of my colleagues and friends are leery about the idea of the supernatural, because it seems to them to disturb that kind of understanding of uniformity on which science is based. And I would want to argue that, of course, nature is largely uniform, not absolutely uniform. Now, oddly for Hume, and I'm not going to take much time on this, the philosophers will spend a lot of time on it, that Hume's denial of miracle on the basis of the uniformity of nature is a little bit odd, because he elsewhere denies the uniformity of nature, in famously saying that although the sun has been observed to rise in the morning for thousands of years, that does not mean that we can be sure that it will rise tomorrow. And that's known as the problem of induction. You can't be absolutely sure, no matter how many times you've observed a particular phenomenon, that it's going to recur. But of course, once you admit or think that nature is not absolutely uniform, suppose Hume is right, and no dead man has ever risen up from the grave throughout the whole of Earth's history so far. By Hume's argument, you cannot say that it won't happen tomorrow. So it seems to dissolve his insistence on the absolute uniformity of nature. In other words, he's undermined the very reason on which he tries to deny the possibility of miracles. And the argument would work backwards in time, wouldn't it? The fact that no one has been observed to rise from the dead in the past 1,000 years is no guarantee that there was no resurrection before that. Uniform experience in England over the past 300 years shows that kings of England are not decapitated. And if you knew this and you were faced with the claim that King Charles I had been decapitated, you might refuse to believe it on the basis of a backwards extrapolation of your uniform experience. And the point is an obvious one. Uniformity is one thing, absolute uniformity is another thing. But Hume actually goes further, because if you cannot infer even the regularities, and Hume has vast descriptions of cause and effect, and as I understand it from trying to read him and read the philosophers that have studied him for years, it would appear he actually denies the very cause and effect relationships which lie behind the laws of nature. And as folks have pointed out, there seems to be a very strange inconsistency. And therefore, I find it somewhat surprising that again and again I am told that Hume, to put it in the words of Christopher Hitchens directly to me in one of our debates, Hume has said the last word on miracles. And Richard Dawkins puts it as ever very clearly, the 19th century is the last time when it was possible for an educated person to admit to believing in miracles like the virgin birth without embarrassment. When pressed, many educated Christians are too loyal to deny the virgin birth and the resurrection. But it embarrasses them because their rational minds know that it is absurd, so they would much rather not be asked. Well, I find that very strange, because I know of many Christians, professors in the sciences in various universities, who are not remotely embarrassed, as I am not embarrassed, to confess a belief in miracles. And you will probably know the names of some of these people. both sides of the fence. There are brilliant scientists who accept the miracles of the New Testament. There are brilliant scientists who reject them. I don't think it's so much to do with science as to do with our worldviews, which may or may not be strongly influenced by our experience of science. Now, I want to just not go on and on forever, but come to what I think there are essentially the things that need to be said. But just as a slight aside to this, Antony Flew, who was a philosopher, died not too long ago, and he was regarded as the world's leading interpreter of David Hume. And he was once a much-fated atheist until in high old age he came to believe in a deistic God on the basis of the semiotic nature of DNA, to which I referred last night. I was very privileged to have a couple of hours with Antony Flew a few years before he died, and I took the opportunity to ask him about David Hume. And he was so honest. It was amazing for a distinguished philosopher. He said, all my books on Hume would have to be revised because they were basically wrong, particularly on this. And I'm going to read just a little of his actual writing, so that I'm not quoting what he said to me directly, but what he wrote. In the light of my newfound awareness that Hume was utterly wrong to maintain that we have no experience and hence no genuine ideas of making things happen, preventing things from happening, of physical necessity and physical impossibility, generations of Humeans have in consequence been misled into offering analyses of causation and of natural law that have been far too weak, because they had no basis for accepting the existence of either cause and effect or natural laws. Hume's skepticism about cause and effect and his agnosticism about the external world are, of course, jettisoned the moment he leaves the study. And therefore, again, it's curious that people think that Hume has solved the problem. Now, I specifically asked Antony Flew about the miracles, and he said he had completely altered his view on that Hume had not dealt with the problem. But I'm going to leave Hume for the moment, because not everybody would argue with him. If you think of the nature of scientific law, many scientists would argue that they do not simply enable us to describe what happens in the past, but they enable us to make predictions. After all, that's the value of having laws. And so the idea that any God, often spelt with a small g, could arbitrarily intervene and alter, suspend, reverse, or otherwise violate these laws would seem to contradict their experience of the apparent immutability of them. And they tend to advance two major arguments. The first is one that also comes from Hume, that belief in miracles, and in the New Testament miracles in particular, arose at a very primitive pre-scientific time. The time of the New Testament, there was no science in that sense. In fact, the word science is a relatively recent word. And so it was a primitive culture where people were completely ignorant of the laws of nature and therefore readily accepted and were gullible when it came to miracle stories. But actually, confining oneself, as I am, to the New Testament miracles, that is not so. Because there are instances throughout the New Testament of a deep understanding of the problem. It is very interesting that the only quasi-scientist who writes in the New Testament, Dr. Luke, probably trained in Alexandria, opens his gospel with the problem. He's got a priest, not an atheist, a priest, standing in the temple. His name is Zechariah. The man is praying, so apparently he believes in prayer. He's leading the prayers of the nation. And an angel turns up and he talks to the angels, so apparently he believes in angels. And the angel says that you are going to have a son. And he said, I am not. And Luke explains to you that he was very old and his wife was very old. Why did he say he wasn't going to have a child? Because he knew, as any modern gynecologist or anybody knows, that, I nearly said thankfully, there comes a time when we can't produce any more kids. Now, this is fascinating because Luke is the only writer in the New Testament that doesn't confine himself to the miraculous, the supernatural conception of Christ. He talks about the conception of John the Baptist. And he raises this issue in the 1st century AD. Zechariah believed in God, believed in angels, believed in prayer, but didn't believe in a God who could intervene to reverse the aging processes of nature. Why not? Because he knew the regularity that old people don't produce children. And similarly, when Joseph discovered that his wife-to-be, Mary, was pregnant, he didn't say, oh, marvelous. He said, well, he wanted to divorce her, didn't he? Why was that? Well, he knew where babies came from. And he knew the baby didn't come from him. So he put two and two together and wanted to get rid of her. And the text tells us, whether you believe it or not, the text tells us that it took very powerful pressure from God to change his mind and accept her. And there's a very humorous, it's brilliantly told in John chapter 9 about a blind man whom Jesus healed, and he was investigated by the intellectuals of the day, and they said, this isn't the man, then he is the man. He asked the parents, and it all goes round, until the man himself got fed up, and he said, look, it has never been known since the beginning of the world that a blind man gets his sight back. He recognized this as a special supernatural intervention of God because he knew the norm. Now, think for a moment. This idea that belief in miracles arose in a primitive, superstitious time cannot be true because unless you know the laws of nature, you couldn't recognize a miracle. If you didn't know that dead bodies don't pop up all over the place out of graveyards, you wouldn't recognize a resurrection as anything special. So the precondition for actually recognizing anything as supernatural is that the context in which it occurs is a context where there are known extensive regularities. In other words, you need a uniformity of nature, but not an absolute uniformity. And that is a very important point, it seems to me, and could be established from other places. Now, the second point is related to it. How do we deal with the question that the laws of nature make miracles impossible because they are violations of it? Now, I notice in North America, we don't have notices like this in the United Kingdom. Violators will be towed. You've seen that notice, haven't you? And the word violation is being used of the laws of the land. And that's a clue to follow, I think, in an analysis of Hume's argument that miracles are violations of the laws of nature. And many, many years ago, I came across in the writings of C.S. Lewis an analogy that I've used many, many times, and I don't apologize for that because an argument doesn't cease to be true because you use it frequently. Lewis gives a simple illustration, and he says, well, let me illustrate it myself. I'm staying in a hotel here in Waterloo, so I put $100 in my drawer last night, and I put $100 in tonight, so that's $200. And I wake up tomorrow morning, I look in the drawer, and there are $50 in it. So what's happened? Have the laws of arithmetic been broken, or the laws of Canada? Now, the reason you're laughing is interesting. You might want to reflect what triggered the laughter. Because actually, the laws of Canada, that is if my wife's not with me and hasn't just taken some money for shopping, but leave that aside. That wouldn't be a miracle at all. How do you know the laws of Canada have been broken? It's because the laws of arithmetic haven't been. You see, we don't react to that kind of a situation and say, well, 1 + 1 = 2 yesterday. It doesn't today. It equals a half or something. No, we don't. You see, the mistake I made in my hotel room was to think that the drawer was a closed system. And I discovered it wasn't. Somebody put their hand in. Now, the laws of arithmetic cannot forbid a thief putting their hand in. There's a misunderstanding as to the nature of scientific law. It's, as Wittgenstein pointed out, and I mentioned last night, a description of what normally happens. But they're not causes, and nor do they have punishments, if you see what I mean, like the laws of the country that force you to do something. So it seems to me to be a better way of understanding things on the basis of this analogy to say that normally speaking, there are these regularities, and because we recognize them, if there appears to be an exception to them, it's not because the laws of nature have been broken down, but it's because the system, not being a closed system, something or someone or some power has entered the system from outside it and done something special. The laws of nature cannot forbid that, of course, because the Creator who created the universe to run normally on the basis of those things is not a prisoner of those laws. He can do something special. Let me try and rephrase that. If I were claiming, for instance, that the resurrection of Christ was caused by some natural processes going on in the grave 5 minutes before it occurred, then you could with right protest and say, well, you are breaking the laws of nature. But I'm not claiming that at all. I'm claiming that God, as the New Testament describes it, by his power raised Christ from the dead. It's not simply a claim that he rose from the dead by some internal mechanism. It's that God raised him from the dead. There's something coming in from outside. And so the big question is, of course, is our universe, extrapolating up from the drawer in my hotel, is it a closed system of cause and effect, or is it not? So it seems to me that, largely speaking, and there is, of course, that more could be said and debated, there are some hugely interesting books that have been written recently about this. But I want to quote C.S. Lewis on this particular thing. If God annihilates or creates or deflects a unit of matter, he has created a new situation at that point. Immediately all nature domiciles this new situation, makes it at home in her realm, adapts all other events to it. It finds itself conforming to all the laws. If God creates a miraculous spermatozoon in the body of a virgin, it does not proceed to break any laws. The laws at once take over. Nature is ready. Pregnancy follows according to all the normal laws. And as Dr. Luke points out, 9 months later, a child is born. And that's very important to see, that this is not playing fast and loose with the laws of nature. It's using the perceived regularities to give a special signature to a very special event that draws attention that this is not a natural inbuilt mechanism, part of the generality and regularity that I believe is ultimately caused by God, but this is a very special event. Now, of course, in order for Hume to claim that no resurrection has occurred, he would have to have, on his own showing, recorded the whole of history. And you know, we can tell something about resurrection statistically. I could arm each of you with a notebook, a lamp, and a thermos flask and a comfortable blanket and send you out into all the graveyards in Waterloo to spend the night. and come back and say if you'd observed a resurrection. And all your books come in and it's 0 everywhere. Well, I said, you've only done one night. How about 3 months? At which some of you might object, but suppose you did that and all get 0. And so on and so forth. No matter how long you did that for, what you can deduce from it is that resurrections are extremely improbable. You cannot deduce they're impossible. To do that, you'd have to have observed the whole of history. And you cannot do that. And so the interesting little thing hidden inside what Hume says is nobody has ever observed it. But that's begging the question, because the fundamental claim of Christianity is that not only one person, but quite a number of people actually observed it. So this question of the supernatural becomes extremely interesting indeed. And we could then address, which I'm not going to do, otherwise I'll take a great deal of time. I just want to finish with the idea that actually belief in the regularities is connected with belief in the supernatural. And again, here I'm indebted to C.S. Lewis, who says that Christians will argue that it is only belief in a creator that gives us satisfactory ground for believing in the uniformity of nature. In the first place, I quote, "If all that exists in nature, the great mindless interlocking event, if our own deepest convictions are merely the byproducts of an irrational process, then clearly there's not the slightest ground for supposing that our sense of fitness and our consequent faith in uniformity tells us anything about a reality external to ourselves. Our convictions are simply a fact about us, like the color of our hair. If naturalism is true, we have no reason to trust our conviction that nature is uniform. It can be trusted only if quite a different metaphysic is true. If the deepest thing in reality, the fact which is the source of all other facthood, is a thing in some degree like ourselves, if it is a rational spirit, and we derive our rational spirituality from it, then indeed our conviction can be trusted. Our repugnance to disorder is derived from nature's creator and ours." And this is an argument I mentioned briefly last night, and I'm now putting it a slightly different way, that excluding the possibility of the supernatural and making nature and its processes absolute in the name of science removes grounds for trusting the rationality of science in the first place. But if you regard nature as part of a greater reality, which includes nature's intelligent creator God, then you have a rational justification for belief in the orderliness of nature, a conviction that, may I remind you, led in large part to the rise of modern science. Thank you very much indeed.